Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the inaugural University of Delaware Cybersecurity Initiative Distinguished Lecture. We're honored to have with us today Michael Chertoff, former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and one of today's foremost experts on preventing and responding to cybersecurity threats. We simply could not have asked for anyone better than to kick off this lecture series. We're also grateful that Secretary Chertoff is here because he understands and shares our vision for this initiative. The university launched the Cybersecurity Initiative last year to become a hub for teaching, research, and expertise, especially in the fields of corporate security. Every day, around the clock, hackers are trying to steal our financial information, our trade secrets, and our personal identities. Rogue nations and terrorists are bent on derailing our economy, threatening our national security, and disrupting our way of life. Cybercrime costs the United States billions of dollars a year and undermines the trust that forms the basis of our global marketplace. So, the UD Cybersecurity Initiative is designed to address two significant challenges. First, every business, from the lone entrepreneur to the international corporation, is vulnerable and trying to protect itself. So, our Cybersecurity Initiative will produce unbiased research, best practices, and standard protocols for optimal security. Second, we need to dramatically expand the pipeline of skilled cybersecurity workers. Experts estimate that in coming years, our nation will need about 40,000 analysts, engineers, technicians, software developers, and others to work in the cybersecurity field. But there are only about 1,000 available workers with those skills. At UD, we'll educate the workers our nation needs now and in the future. And this is the perfect place to bring it all together. About 2 hours north of UD is New York City, the commercial capital of the world. About 2 hours south is Washington, D.C., the military and intelligence capital of the world. So, we like to say that clearly UD sits at the center of the known universe. UD can help make the essential connections between the corporate community and the military and intelligence communities. We can be that bridge, both substantively, through dialogue, teaching, and research, and physically, as a place to work and collaborate. Also, Delaware is the legal home of more than 1 million corporations. Businesses of all sizes, including the majority of the Fortune 500, are here because of Delaware's highly respected court system. Legal questions in the evolving field of corporate cybersecurity will be decided right here in Delaware. What's more, the University of Delaware already has a lot of expertise to build a world-class cybersecurity program. We have a highly regarded computer engineering and computer science program, along with some of the nation's premier experts in corporate law and policy. We're working with the Army and the Delaware National Guard to develop top-notch cybersecurity courses here. We've launched a minor in cybersecurity last fall, and we're developing a master's program to begin later this year. We're partnering with Delaware State University, Delaware Tech, private companies, and other institutions to develop workforce training and research programs. UD and a handful of other top universities are supporting the MITRE Corporation's federally funded R&D center dedicated to enhancing the nation's cybersecurity efforts. And one of our most valuable resources is right over there. Dr. Starnes Walker is the founding director of the UD Cybersecurity Initiative. Dr. Walker comes to UD with more than 35 years of deep and far-reaching experience in this field. He has held senior leadership positions in the U.S. Departments of Homeland Security, Energy, and Defense, and he's also worked in private industry. He continues to share his expertise with the Aspen Institute, Purdue University, Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and many, many other organizations. Dr. Walker will introduce our distinguished speaker, and maybe later you can help me with my iPhone to make sure nobody hacks it. Dr. Walker.
Thank you, Dr. Harker. I think I can probably find someone to help you with your iPhone, so no problem. Well, I mean, thank you for the opportunity to lead this University of Delaware cybersecurity initiative. This effort, as we all know, is extremely important, not just to the university, but to the nation, to our nation's industry, and to all of us here that are sitting here and around the world. So we read about it every day. Every institution and every one of us is vulnerable. We read about it. It's an issue for all of us. But at the same time, there's a partnership that we all combine to work together, and we find that we actually are an asset by working together, and it's important. An effective cybersecurity strategy requires a strong partnership of government, industry, and academia. Now, I've been privileged to know and work for and with Michael for about 15 years. I can say without hesitation that Michael is one of the most inspiring and enlightening and creative people I've ever worked for. So it's been lots of fun and continues to be fun. As a little background, Michael earned his law degree from Harvard Law School in 1978. He served as the clerk to Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. As a federal prosecutor, Michael successfully pursued corrupt politicians, white-collar criminals, mobsters, terrorists. Interestingly, he helped investigate the 9/11 attacks and led the prosecution of terrorist Zacchaeus Moussaoui. Michael served as a federal judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Third Circuit. In 2005, Michael was named Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, it's difficult to list all of his achievements, and many of them you won't even know about. But the idea of preventing attacks from happening is one of the things he did most well. Now, one challenge that you did hear about was the attention that was gained with Hurricane Katrina. He led the reorganization of FEMA, and what we saw later with the Superstorm Sandy was, in fact, FEMA was praised for its quick response, its capabilities, its organizational aspects. This was something that Michael had led and instituted. That's why you heard about it. Now, one thing I can add, too, in terms of working for Michael, you better make sure you have your facts clear, because I always found that when you went in to brief Michael, it had to be concise, it had to be accurate, it had to be complete. He had always done his homework. Now, before making a decision, he would always consider all aspects. Policy, do we have the authority to act? Are the laws embodied there correct? How will Congress respond? Do we need help from the Hill? How do we communicate this to the public? These are each aspects and important to the Homeland Security mission. And I would say, most importantly, what's the right thing we should do? Now, Michael left Homeland Security in 2009. He formed the Chertoff Group, where he advises corporate and government leaders on a variety of securities issues, both nationally and internationally. He's also assembled an A-team of principals. Now, I'm fortunate that we still work together on Aspen Institute's Homeland Security Group, and I learn all kinds of great wisdom when I'm around Michael, and I'm sure you're going to today as well. So with that, I'd like to provide applause and invite Michael to the podium.
That's a very kind introduction and tough to live up to. I'll do my best. But I really want to thank Dr. Walker. I want to thank Starnes for inviting me here. We have had a great opportunity to work together over the years, and I was delighted to accept his invitation to come up and address you during the kickoff of this cybersecurity center. I also want to thank Dr. Harker for his very insightful words. I think that there really is an opportunity by getting academia involved in partnership with government and with the private sector to really do something to raise the level of our security with respect to cyber attacks. This is something we read about all the time, and a lot of the things that are most concerning you don't read about. And that's emblematic of the fact that maybe more than any other security challenge, cyber attacks tend to tax our institutional capabilities in dealing with defense and security. Earlier this year, during the State of the Union, President Obama actually used his speech to highlight the importance of cybersecurity and to talk about the steps his administration was undertaking to try to raise the level of security across the country when it comes to cyber attacks. And as you know from news reporting, later this week, the president is going out to Stanford. Sorry, it's not going to be Delaware, it's going to be Stanford, but the weather is a lot better out in California. He's going to go out to Stanford and host a summit to talk about cybersecurity that, again, is going to engage the public sector as well as the private sector. Now, you might ask, why is this getting the kind of top-level attention it's getting when we are in a world in which, frankly, there are a lot of serious and dangerous challenges that are currently underway. For example, I was at the Munich Security Conference in Germany just a few days ago, and there was a lot of discussion about Ukraine and what the Russians are doing there. There was concern about ISIS, Boko Haram, and other affiliated violent jihadi groups operating in North Africa, West Africa, and other parts of the region in the Middle East and in South Asia. There are challenges in the Pacific with respect to a rising China that is becoming more energetic and projecting its power. But with all of this, I agree with Federal Chief Information Officer Lisa Schlosser, who said recently that cyber threats pose one of the gravest national security dangers to the United States. So why is that? Well, it's not just about denying you service, access to your favorite website. It's not just about taking your credit card, or those are bad enough. But the consequences of cyber attacks and breaches can be even more secure and can strike at the fundamental assets upon which we rely in our economic system and in our political system. In fact, you don't have to look very far to hear of the latest breach or the latest episode of a nation-state actor trying to either acquire our nation's secrets or to disrupt our businesses. Let's just go through a few highlights in the last year. The Russians have broken into a White House network and the network of JP Morgan Chase. Now, these are the same Russians who, by the way, are not only in the Ukraine, but who attacked Estonia with a cyber attack in 2007 and Georgia with a cyber attack in 2008. As the US government has acknowledged, and as you've read in a public report by the Mandiant Company, the Chinese have been particularly persistent in trying to gain access to intellectual property and conducting espionage. They've stolen blueprints, manufacturing processes, clinical trial results for drugs that are emerging in the market, and other proprietary data from more than 140 companies, and they've even penetrated major media. Very recently, we learned about North Korea leading a destructive and coercive attack against Sony Pictures Entertainment because they didn't like a movie. And while you might pass that off as maybe a little bit overly enthusiastic film criticism, all kidding aside, that strikes at the First Amendment and our ability to speak and say things, even if they're maybe not that clever or even if they're incorrect. It's the same mentality that we saw in Paris when a satirical cartoon magazine was attacked in the physical world. Last month, attackers disrupted production at a German steel plant and damaged its blast furnaces, again, only using cyber. A grim and clear demonstration of the fact that attacks over a network are not just about information, but they literally affect the operation of critical industrial control systems. And a few months ago, a widespread encryption vulnerability known as Heartbleed plagued consumers and industries alike. And of course, we read about the massive credit card and similar breaches at retail and other commercial establishments on a regular basis. So how do we deal with this? How do we not feel overwhelmed and throw our hands up and say to ourselves whether the internet is really going to survive all of this? Well, when I was at the Department of Homeland Security, and now as a part of the private sector, I've worked with industries and enterprises of all sizes to talk about how you manage risk in a forward-looking fashion that doesn't have unrealistic expectations, but gives us a sense that we can control, manage, and mitigate the risk so we can get the benefit out of what the internet does but reduce the vulnerabilities and the damage that can be caused by those who would abuse it. While cybersecurity can really risk high-scale threats, consequences, complexity, and severity, that means that no enterprise is immune. In other words, if you believe that what you're searching for, the holy grail in cybersecurity, is I don't want to have anybody penetrate or steal my data ever, that 100% security cannot be achieved. The only way to do it is to totally disconnect, which is actually a lot harder, as I will explain, than you think. The reality is 100% protection is not possible, and chasing that misleads us into pursuing unproductive pathways. Moreover, no one entity can be an island in protecting itself. If we're going to attempt to minimize and mitigate the risk of cyber attacks, we have to work as a team. It's a shared mission with government and industry, and with information being the connectivity that binds us together and allows us to work cooperatively. And finally, as we talk about putting together partnerships, academia, institutions like this university, need to be part of that partnership. And again, I want to commend the university for stepping up and investing in this center. So let me step back, talk about why I say you cannot have 100% security, and then begin to talk about the strategies we have to pursue to protect ourselves in a world of a ubiquitous internet. As many know, the internet was not created as a commercial enterprise. It began, ironically, as an exercise in resiliency. Members of the defense establishment were concerned about the possibility in a massive attack of having our regular communication structures destroyed. So they wanted to come up with an architecture that would allow resilient workarounds if some of the critical elements of our communication infrastructure were incapacitated. And because they all trusted each other, they were all part of the defense and academic establishment, what they were focused on was making the ability to repair and remediate easy. They weren't worried about trust, because by definition, the people who were involved in this effort and this initiative knew each other and trusted each other. But once the internet left that relatively confined mission and turned out to be a capability that was involved in commercial activity, critical government efforts across the entire spectrum, and even personal and social lives, that lack of trust as an essential ingredient became a big vulnerability. The reality is, when you are online, there is no way to be sure that the person you think you are communicating with or the website you are going to is really that person or that website. There is no 100% certainty with the basic architecture of the network. And so we've had to think about how do you manage that problem. The problem is maybe best encapsulated by a New Yorker magazine cartoon. I think it goes back 15 or 20 years. It's back in the days of big clunky PCs on the desk. And there's a drawing of a PC, and there are two dogs talking to each other. And one dog says to the other, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And in many ways, that sums up the problem. So with this lack of trust, and with the ability of people to masquerade as others, and use that as a way to gain entry into our own networks, what we've seen again and again is the capability that people have, if they're bad actors, to corrupt information, to steal information, to deny access or introduce latency or delay in the transmission of information, to destroy or overwhelm networks, and of course to steal all kinds of information for financial gain. If I were to group these types of consequences, I would say in the main they fall into three categories. The one that's maybe the most long-standing set of security challenges, and the one that we still read about the most, and probably the one that touches us personally the most, is the use of the network to steal financial information for the purposes of committing fraud. Identity information, credit card information, access to bank accounts. As you've read, there have been literally millions of dollars stolen in this way. In the last couple of years, for example, there was one organized criminal effort to gain access to ATMs. What they did was they hacked into a couple of firms overseas that were managing debit cards and ATM withdrawal cards, and they had the withdrawal limits on those cards removed. Then on a single day, individuals working as part of this conspiracy were sent out to ATM machines all over the world to withdraw all the money from the machines. Because the withdrawal limits were gone, they could take every bit of cash that was in those machines. And in a single day before it was shut down, tens of millions of dollars were stolen. So that's a classic example of the fact that because the internet is now where the money is, it's like Willie Sutton. To paraphrase Willie Sutton, you don't have to rob banks anymore by going in with a gun. You just rob it through the ATM or the credit card. A second area of things that we have seen are denial of service attacks. These aren't maybe the most sophisticated attacks. They don't ultimately destroy systems or networks. They don't kill people, but they interfere with the ability to get access to perhaps your bank or some other facility that you need to communicate with. And they create an enormous burden and drag and expense for enterprises. But the third and most consequential from a national security standpoint, the third type of category of attacks we worry about are attacks that actually could be corruptive or destructive. Imagine what would happen if malevolent actors penetrated into banks and were able over a period of time in a very subtle way to change bank records. If you didn't have a backup for transactions, you might have a crisis of confidence in banks similar to what we saw in 2008 when we had our financial crisis. You could have destruction of critical infrastructure. But unlike in Sony, which destroyed a business enterprise's tools and information technology architecture, you could actually have attacks on critical infrastructure that deals with transportation. The train that I came up with, the airplane I might fly in, maybe power. And that could actually cause loss of life as well as significant economic and property damage. And one of the reasons this problem is particularly urgent now is we are entering what some call the age of the Internet of Things, where more and more everyday objects are being connected up. They're supposed to be smart in the sense that they actually have chips in them and are able to do computer-like tasks. And even more important, they are connected as part of a giant network, often wirelessly. Now, maybe it's a great thing to have your refrigerator be able to know when it has to automatically order milk because your milk is low. But remember, if these systems are not built in a way that is robust with respect to security, they create surface area for attacks. For example, there was a report yesterday issued by Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts that talked about the risks to automobiles, given the fact that most automobiles now that are relatively recent vintage are connected in a variety of ways to outside networks, whether it is your GPS, whether it is your satellite radio, and particularly if we get to the point where they're going to be self-driving cars, which is what you read about being experimented with, all of these will become pathways to having somebody perhaps come in and affect the performance of the automobile itself. At some of the recent Black Hat conferences, people have actually demonstrated the ability to affect the braking and the driving and the steering of an automobile using access through some of these systems. And there was a story I read coming up on the train about televisions that are now going to be smart enough that they can actually respond to oral commands that you give them when you're sitting in the room watching television. Now, they're not designed to pick up your everyday conversation, but imagine if somebody hacks into those systems, particularly using a wireless entry point, and is now able to direct the system to record everything. I mean, it would literally be the embodiment of Big Brother. So what we're seeing is not only an increase in the kinds of attacks, but a dramatic expansion of the surface area in which attacks can take place. And most important, this is everywhere. It's not concentrated only on business enterprises or particular locations or within a particular type of activity. They occur on personal systems, within our homes, within our offices, within our academic institutions. This is the new normal, and these security episodes will continue to be part of our everyday life. But there is good news, because even as these threats rise, cooperation is increasing among people who operate critical infrastructure and between critical infrastructure and government. In fact, in the wake of the Sony attack, maybe because it was a destructive attack, not merely stealing data, but actually destroying machines and making it difficult to operate, critical business systems, there's been a real uptick in people's sense of urgency about dealing with these challenges. And so that's good news. Government is doing more things, but it can't be government alone. Government has to work with the people who own and operate the critical infrastructure and with the academics who are doing research into those techniques and tactics which are both representing emerging threats, but also emerging solutions. So with this cooperation in mind, how do we proceed? Well, as I said earlier, it's about risk management, not risk elimination. So we have to understand what risk is. And in my experience, again, both at DHS, at the Department of Homeland Security, and in the private sector, we typically thought of risk as embodying three elements. Threat. Who's out there that has the motive and the capability to cause you damage? That's a matter of intelligence, collection, and analysis. Vulnerability. What are the parts of your enterprise or your government agency that are less than secure and can be the entry point for an attack, whether a physical attack or a cyber attack? And finally, and I always thought this was most important, consequence. What are the worst consequences of a successful attack? And how do you manage and mitigate those consequences to reduce the bad effects of a successful attack? If you look back over the last 20 years when people have talked about cybersecurity, most of the risk they have focused on is vulnerability. It's about hardening the perimeter. It's about patching against loopholes or opportunities for people to come in with malware. It's about making adjustments when there are exploits that are found. And that is still an important part of risk. But even if you practice perfect cyber hygiene, you always update your antivirus, you put the latest sensors on your network, you monitor what's within, you can block a lot of malware, but you're not going to block everything. And so you have to build a security strategy with the understanding that anybody with anything of value will, from time to time, be the subject of a successful breach. And that's why much of the energy and focus these days, and much of the research, is now moving to the issue of consequence management. Because if you can detect and remediate an attack within a matter of days, the damage will be far less than on those occasions where we've unfortunately seen malicious exploits sitting in networks for months, if not years. And that's why consequence management, I think, is going to be the next element of what a major strategy for research and implementation will look to. So how do you think about managing your cybersecurity consequences? Well, I would say there are three elements. One is it's got to be based on the highest risk, meaning where the consequences matter the most. It's got to be intuitive, meaning it can't be something that works at cross purposes with the efficient way in which your enterprise needs the network to operate. And it has to be anchored in trust. It has to be a situation that human beings can trust, both because there's accountability for the people who manage the function of cybersecurity and because there's accountability to senior levels of the enterprise. Now, as I said earlier, earlier in the year in the State of the Union, President Obama talked about cybersecurity. And last week, the White House showcased its commitment to an important role of government for cybersecurity by highlighting a $14 billion proposed spending on cybersecurity throughout the budget plan for fiscal year 2016. That is a 10% increase in cybersecurity spending over the previous year. Moreover, even more recently, I think in fact today, the White House announced a new initiative with respect to the critical issue of information sharing, which is the development of what they are calling the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, or the CTIC. This is an effort to focus on the threat element of risk by collecting all the intelligence and information gathered by intelligence agencies, whether it's the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, or other agencies, unifying and bringing it together in one place, as we did with counterterrorism, so that the government actors can have complete visibility into where all the threats are coming from, so that we connect the dots in cyberspace as we have been doing in the area of counterterrorism. Now, that's just within the government. As important, maybe more important, is how do you share information and intelligence and best practices between the government and the private sector and among the private sector. Because the reality is that most of the activity online is in private hands. And that means it's going to be the private sector that first experiences and has the opportunity to see and the responsibility to remediate attacks in the private sector networks. We do not have a society, nor do we want one, in which the government sits on everybody's network and watches what goes on inside of it. And that means those who legitimately own the networks have to take on that responsibility and have to have a mechanism for sharing with the government. So in this respect, one of the things the White House has talked about, and I think we're hopeful that this becomes embodied in congressional legislation, is to work on a mechanism that allows easier and more fluid sharing between the private sector and the government and among the private sector when it comes to cyber attacks. And the reason it's important is this. I like to analogize cybersecurity a little bit to the human body and the way your immune system works. Your body does not keep all viruses and germs outside. Yes, your skin and your membranes and other parts of your exterior are designed to keep a lot of dangerous and bad stuff out. But your body is also designed to be able to monitor when something enters to determine whether it's benign or dangerous. And then your immune system, depending upon what it is, will attack it and kill it, most of the time successfully. In fact, the reason we immunize is because immunization essentially gives your white blood cells, your immune system, what I would call the, quote, signature of a malicious virus, like a flu virus, so we can be prepared in advance to recognize that virus when it enters and eliminate it. That is a human body version of information sharing. And for that reason, when we do encounter cyber viruses or cyber exploits that have signatures or IP addresses or characteristics, the ability to capture that and to communicate to others is a way of immunizing the entire system against cyber attacks, much as a human body does. So how do we do this? Because it's challenging. We've got literally hundreds of thousands of enterprises. Well, one thing that the White House has proposed is to come up with what we call information sharing and analysis organizations. These would be platforms in which relevant actors, whether it be in a particular type of business or in a particular region, would be able to get together and exchange in real-time information about attacks when they're underway. They can be connected up to the government through the Department of Homeland Security's NCIC, which is the DHS Cyber Information Center, to make sure that all of the characteristics and descriptors of this particular attack can be identified and then shared within the entire network. This builds upon an earlier version of information sharing that was organized strictly along lines of individual sectors of the economy, financial sector, communication sector, et cetera. But what's different about this is the recognition that we not only have to have banks talking to banks and energy companies talking to energy companies, but we have to have different types of enterprises talking to each other, often on a regional basis. So these platforms hold out the opportunity to actually increase the depth and the intensity of the partnering among private enterprises and with the government as well. Now, concretely, what are the benefits we can see as we start to deploy and join these information sharing organizations? Well, as I said earlier, on an operational level, we can get information about attacks that might be pending. You know, one of the things about a lot of bad guys is they're not particularly careful themselves about whether they're maintaining confidentiality or secrecy. A lot of them talk online or they exchange information on social networks. So often it's possible to get some advance warning of a pending attack and then spread the word quickly. These kinds of mechanisms can also share, as I said earlier, signatures. They can share trends. They can share IP addresses. And they can educate and share lessons about best practices so that even before there is an attack, as people learn from experience, and that's, again, like your body learns from having been ill, When you've been attacked, you learn something from that. Spreading that around gives all of us the benefit of that. And finally, these organizations can begin to address the issue of training standards, because much of what we see when there are cyber attacks, particularly in consequence management, has to do whether people know what to do when they discover malware, or even learn to recognize the signs that there might be malware so they can raise a red flag and begin the process of responding. And finally, let me say this. We've seen over and over again that there's a physical dimension to cybersecurity. Yes, cyber attacks are focused on the network, but often it is the physical entry point that is the area where vulnerability is the greatest. Whether it is someone taking a thumb drive that's infected and putting it into a device, either maliciously or negligently, or whether it's somebody using open wireless that is not properly protected in order to capture or insert malicious executable code, physical access becomes an important part of cybersecurity. And by the way, one of the things which continues to amaze me is this. People will put thumb drives that they get from all over the place in their machines. They did an experiment, actually they've done a number of experiments, where they put thumb drives on the floor of like a parking lot. And they wait to see how many people pick them up and put them in their machine. And it's like 50%. But if you put a logo on it, like if you put, like the Philadelphia Eagles on it, it would be 95%. So people say to me like, well, what's wrong with that? I said, well, let me ask you this. If you were walking in the parking lot and there was a hamburger on the floor, would you pick it up and put it in your mouth? Well, that's basically the cyber equivalent of the same thing. So part of what these organizations have to do is they have to help raise the level of education, training, and standards. Now, academic institutions are in a very pivotal position in promoting and being part of these information sharing organizations because they're trusted. They have roots in government, as Starnes pointed out earlier and as President Harker pointed out, but they also have good relationships with industry, including because of their alumni who go to work in many businesses. And because of the ability to put research in emerging areas of technology, they can begin to proliferate solutions at the earliest possible stage to help anticipate where problems may arise. And as I said earlier, I think the Internet of Things is going to be one area that ought to be looked at very carefully. I've seen some of this cross-cooperation firsthand in the last year. Last November, I joined Michigan Governor Rick Snyder at the North American International Cyber Summit in Detroit. Now, this was not a federally run summit. It was organized by the state of Michigan. And in this effort, Governor Snyder unveiled the Michigan Cyber Initiative, which included federal actors, state actors, university actors, and the private sector as well. And as part of this regional focus and regional joint activity, the members of this initiative enhanced Michigan's cyber defense response team, began to put out cyber awareness programs and career path programs for schools in Michigan and the surrounding area, increased the frequency of cybersecurity exercises for both government and industry, worked on developing economic development partnerships that would be designed to invest in cybersecurity, and developed a mechanism for cyber threat warning levels that could be deployed to the population as a whole. Each of these efforts as part of this Michigan initiative requires partnership and collaboration with industry, government, and academics. And that is a great example of what can be done. In another, again, cold part of the country, late last year, I participated in a similar effort in Boston, Massachusetts. In Boston, the Advanced Cybersecurity Center is a nonprofit research consortium that brings together university, industry, and government organizations, again, to work on a regional basis to focus on cyber threats. Again, as in Michigan, their effort involves sharing cyber threat information, engaging in and promoting next-generation cybersecurity research and development, working on education programs at the university level and even at the high school level, and thinking about public policies in general that will advance security. Again, another example of collaboration that takes place across sectors and is regionally based. As President Harker said, this particular state is a great place to do that. It is the place of incorporation for many of the world's largest industrial and other companies. It is located in proximity to the government in Washington and the financial community up in New York. And this is maybe a little more subtle point, the fact that the legal superstructure that governs much of corporate law in this country, including the responsibility of boards of directors and how corporations and enterprises are obliged to take account of risk, the fact that that's located in Delaware creates a particularly fruitful opportunity to bring together the technical expertise and the legal fundamental structure in order to come up with an intelligence and technologically driven set of legal requirements that would apply to enterprises and boards of directors who are looking at cybersecurity. I can tell you, having been a judge, I wouldn't say technical capabilities at the very top level of what judges are known for, but if you can marry together some of the research that's done and the know-how that you can find here and educate the courts, that's going to be part of the DNA of corporate America, and that's going to be very, very important in two things. First, in promoting cybersecurity, but also in giving people a sense of what is reasonable and what they need to do to satisfy reasonableness. Because one of the biggest challenges companies feel today is, yes, they know there's a problem, but they don't know how much they need to do to solve it. They feel there's a limitless liability. And while Congress could do a lot, and I hope will do a lot, to begin to set some liability safe harbors that will give people a sense of what they need to do and then how much is enough, a lot of that work can simply be done using the common law and using the kind of legal doctrine that's developed in the courts of this state to begin to set out a rational and intelligent framework for managing risk as a legal matter and not merely as an operational matter. So I think everybody is now energized to go pursue this issue. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate the challenge, because when you talk about cyber threats, you've got many, many different kinds of threats. But I am encouraged by the fact that at every level, government, industry, and academia, there's now greater investment in this area. In fact, the White House recently provided $25 million in grants over the next 5 years to support a cybersecurity education consortium. That's a recognition that the foot soldiers, the people who are going to be on the front line of dealing with cybersecurity in the next 5 years are going to come out of places like this. And we've got to create opportunities for education and experience so that we can really populate ourselves with a kind of workforce that is able to carry out this very, very important mission. So if I can leave you with one thought today, it's this. Unlike all other kinds of security threats we face, in the area of cyber, the threat doesn't come simply from nation states or one kind of criminal organization. It comes from networks. People who individually or in groups come together, exchange partners, come and go, but operate as networks in order to create risks. And as they say, the only way to beat a network is with a network. The government is not going to rescue us from cyber threats, although it's going to play an important part. No business is going to have the ability on its own to protect itself from cyber threats, although it has important responsibilities in this respect. The only way we're going to beat the networks that attack us is by networks that work together and collaborate to defend us. And that kind of public-private partnership, use of information sharing, and taking ownership of our own responsibility to manage our networks is going to be the key to success in this emerging set of security challenges in the 21st century. So again, I commend you again, and with that, I'd be happy to take a few minutes of questions. Thank you. I think we have microphones. Yes, go ahead.
Secretary Chertoff, Peter Connor from Texas. Since you've talked a great deal about cybersecurity, mostly on defensive operations, what happens when you get a call from a C-level executive in a Global 1000 company, the first thing he asks you is who did it, which deals with the attribution, and I want you to attack them back. Can you discuss the legal and policy implications of that, please?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been asked this a lot, and I understand that there are companies out there in the business of hacking back that have propagated the idea that you ought to be able to hack back and get your stuff back, or even take offline the server that attacked you. Here's my answer. Don't try this at home. First of all, it's probably against the law in many countries. Second, the ability to know with certainty where the genesis of an attack is it's pretty challenging. And even more challenging is being able to take something offline or interfere with someone else's network without causing collateral consequences. In fact, most attackers use hot points to jump around from server to server, or use bots that they've basically taken over, computers where the owner is unwitting in the fact that his computers become part of a network of attacks. So that both from a legal and an operational standpoint, I think it would be very dangerous and risky to try to recover your lost items or to retaliate against the attacker. If someone breaks into your house, even if you know who the burglar is, you're not allowed to go back into his house and grab the stuff back. You're supposed to call the police. Now, it's different if you ask me, should the government play a role in doing that? And I think the answer is yes, there is a role for the government to play. It may be a role in preventing an attack if you see an incipient attack coming up, or if there's a persistent attack, it may involve removing the source of that attack, probably in the case of something that would be destructive. I think the federal government has articulated the idea, not a surprise, that cyber attack that was destructive would be regarded as an act of war. And if there was loss of life and serious property damage, you would expect the response that you would get if someone launched a missile or dropped a bomb. But again, I think that's a government responsibility. Now, there are some things you can do. I'm not giving legal advice here, but I mean, there are things that you can do that give you a little bit more of an active defense. For example, by configuring your system so you have perhaps an attractive honeypot that will bring in someone who's intruding so you can capture the malware and analyze it. I don't see that as necessarily a destructive or dangerous thing to do, and it does give you the ability to get a little bit of an advanced look at something. So there are things you can do to be more active, but I would be very hesitant to try to, revive what they used to call letters of marque, where 3 centuries ago they sent privateers out to go fight pirates. It's not going to work in cyberspace. Yes.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. My name is David Wunsch. I'm the state geologist of Delaware. And I've been involved in a lot of big data type programs, and we're hearing that catchword a lot. Of course, the White House has its open data initiative. But I'm wondering what your thoughts, or if you could comment on some of these systems now, because, for example, the one I'm working on, what you're really doing is not building or sharing your data or giving it to somebody. You're creating portals that allow somebody to click and follow links into your data. But anytime you click something like that, that creates perhaps an executable, those could be hijacked. And I'm wondering, it's a great thought that we can create all these huge data sets and get more insight into the scientific world, but also is there this danger of somebody hijacking these and really creating malice?
I think you put your finger on what is the real challenge here, because the problem is you want to be open in certain types of enterprises. You want to invite people to come in, but you have to be careful to make sure that your data isn't stolen or treated inappropriately, or that your system isn't actually infected. How to verify who's coming in, how to deal with the issue of encryption to the extent you want to encrypt certain things, how to configure your system so that executables will not be allowed in or will not be allowed to execute. I think these are kind of our cutting edge technical issues where a lot of research has to be done. But the good news is this: if you're thinking about it, you're thinking about architecting your system in a way to minimize that risk. If what you do, what a lot of enterprises do, which is slap together a lot of different systems without any real sense of who can get on the system where they're allowed to go, who has administrator credentials, so they're able to actually get into the portions of your network that actually control the various functions. If you're not thinking about that, you're way behind the curve. If you are, then things like access controls, controls about credentials and privileges, are ways at least to manage the risk down. Yeah, back there.
Ralph Begleiter with the University of Delaware. Secretary Chertoff, you mentioned the issue of trust many times in your remarks today. I'm curious whether you think research is also needed in, and you talked about picking up thumb drives on the parking lot ground. Is there research also needed in human behavior aspects of cybersecurity, training ordinary people in how to think about cybersecurity, not just so much the technical aspects of it, but the behavioral aspects of it?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that is an under-considered element of cybersecurity. Many of the fundamental challenges in cybersecurity are human challenges. They're not about the technical piece. A lot of the worst exploits have gotten into networks because people made mistakes. They clicked on something, they went to a website, there was a watering hole that sucked up their data. In Foreign Affairs some years back, the former Deputy Defense Secretary Bill Lynn wrote about a major intrusion into Defense Department networks that occurred because a mid-grade officer in the field took a thumb drive and put it into the machine when he'd been given it and introduced malware into the system. Maybe I'm oversimplifying slightly, but it's kind of a useful way to think about it. We all make choices about what's online, what data we keep, who we give it access to, what we store and what we dispose of. Those are fundamental security questions. To put it this way, I mean, there was a discussion recently about the fact that some of the Sony emails that were hacked and made public were embarrassing. And the question is, how do you prevent people from getting those emails? Don't write them. Now, that sounds silly, but actually think about it. Someone made a choice. Or, for example, if I really want to have a resilient backup for my data, what do I do at home? I get a yellow piece of paper out, I put on the yellow piece of paper, I put it in my drawer. I'm very confident no hacker's getting into the drawer in my house. They sound simplistic and dumb, but I think a critical message here is sometimes the pathway to cybersecurity is not technical. Technical elements are a part of a strategy, but they are not a strategy. And if we can better learn how to teach people cyber hygiene, we will dramatically reduce the number of attacks that we have. Yes, over there.
So it makes a lot of sense that risk management should be trust-based and collaborative. And yet we've seen in very recent history a push from the government for the criminalization of crypto between statements from the president and the Department of Justice. They've made anti-encryption statements. And we've also seen in recent history the government pushing Silicon Valley operations like Skype to put vulnerabilities in their software. So my question is, why should citizens cooperate with a government that only wants its people to have personal cybersecurity when it's convenient?
So I mean, I think that's a fair question. And I want to begin by saying a lot of these issues are debatable. And it's also true that the folks who are focused on having maybe limits on crypto or want to have the capability to get into systems are actually often performing a different function from those who are trying to defend systems. But I do think that what you point out, and I think the discussion is beginning now, is we need perhaps to rethink comprehensively some of the strategic trade-offs about what we do on the offensive side and the defensive side. So I'm going to give you a personal opinion here. Not that, I mean, everything I've said is a personal opinion, but I think that I've wrestled with the question about whether we ought to restrict the ability to encrypt, as a number of companies are now in the process of debating. Or to be a little bit more precise, should we require companies that are in the business of managing and running networks to have a back door or to retain a capability to get into encrypted data apart from the sender and the recipient. This is, by the way, a recapitulation of a debate back in the 90s about something that was called carnivore, which was a requirement about what was then a concern about some of the communications technology. I guess I've come to the conclusion that we probably should not make it a legal requirement that companies maintain an ability to decrypt encrypted communications. I say that for two reasons. I understand that there will be a cost to the government if you get a device and you can't decrypt it, and the company can't decrypt it, and the person who owns the device is not going to cooperate. So I accept that that's a cost in security. But I think as a society, we generally do not take the view that it's the responsibility of the citizen to make life easy for the police. Otherwise, we would simply give everybody a body camera and say, you got to wear this all the time and record everything you do, so when you commit a crime, it's easy to convict you. So I'm not minimizing the security challenge, but I think that as a society, we probably don't want to go that far. There's a practical issue, too, which is someone out there is going to make a capability or device that's encrypted that doesn't have an accessible opportunity for the person running the network to get at to decrypt the data. All that's going to happen is the bad guys are going to go to that, and they're going to have the protection anyway, and the good guys are going to wind up without that protection and some greater vulnerability. On the issue of, again, implanting vulnerabilities, again, I think strategically, it's a bad idea for this country if it were to say, for example, let's create a vulnerability and insert it in software that's generally available or generally made part of the marketplace. Again, because I think we wind up, although it's an easier way to get stuff, I think we wind up hurting our values and frankly hurting our interests as our economic interests in basically saying our software and hardware is not as secure as it could be because we've deliberately made it insecure. Now, by the way, I separate that from, if I knew a particular device was going to be delivered to the bomb maker in Yemen, who's working for Al-Qaeda, I'd be perfectly happy to put a vulnerability in that device. But that would be targeted. I think we need to treat creating vulnerabilities in the same way we talk about doing things in the physical world. Targeted is good. Indiscriminate is probably not good. Again, I acknowledge the fact these are hard decisions, and I've been in the law enforcement community one way or another in the last 25, 30 years, and a lot of my colleagues probably would disagree with me. But again, I do think one of the things that cyber challenges you to do is to recognize that you got to look at 360 degrees of the problem. All too often, people are very well-meaning, but they have a particular mission. And what they do is, I'm going to accomplish this mission, and that's all I want to do. The job of our political leadership and the people at the very top of organizations is always to say, wait, before we do this, let's look at all the dimensions, pluses and minuses, and make a strategic decision across the entire spectrum of our national interests, which include our civil liberties, our economic interests, and our security interests, about where to draw the balance. And so I think this is going to be part of, again, what we want to discuss academically. Guess we have room for one more, time for one more? Yeah. All right, over there. Yeah.
I'm Danny DeMarinis. You mentioned about the ISACs, and I think that's very important, the information exchanges, the information sharing of information. You further went on to show an improvement in them, in that you said they should not only be within a given sector, but they should be cross-sector. Right. I think that's also an improvement. One of the issues in the past, and so along the lines of not a technical issue, but a lot of firms have been very hesitant to share information on their vulnerabilities, potential compromises, and the associated consequences because of liability concerns. Have there been policy changes or changes in the law that would better motivate this important information sharing that is so critical?
So I wish. There was legislation that was proposed, bipartisan legislation, in the last few years in the Senate that would have done that, would have created liability protection for information sharing and confidentiality. It did not pass. The president, I think, has asked Congress to pass it. I know there are leaders in both the Republican and the Democratic parties who want to pass something that has that protection. Honestly, there are some groups advocacy groups that say, oh no, that's bad because it means people can, exchange information that will invade people's privacy. I think what they're overlooking at is the fact that the information you're exchanging has to do with, by definition, people who are trying to intrude in your network. So they're already invading your privacy. The question is, are you more worried about criminals invading your privacy or more worried about the companies that are managing the network invading your privacy? And I think it's obvious that you should be more worried about the former. I'm hopeful that this is actually an area you could get bipartisan action. I think everybody kind of agrees with this. But I do think we have to stop admiring the problem, and we do need to get some action. And I would say this, I'd say on the legal side, there may be some opportunities, again, in a common law sense, to create legal doctrines here in Delaware that will facilitate that kind of information sharing, particularly as it relates to the responsibilities of directors, that you see to it that they're not penalized by sharing information that's designed to raise the level of security for everybody.
Thank you, Michael, for this fascinating address, and thank you for coming to the University of Delaware. We appreciate that. Also, I'd like to thank the audience and all the participants here and the questions, and I'd like to invite all of you to join us for a reception in the outer area there starting now. So thank you all, and thank you.